Good afternoon and welcome to John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Thank you for joining us for this critical discussion with journalists on the media's impact on New York State bail reform. At John Jay, we educate our students to become leaders, scholars, and engaged citizens who advance the goals of safety and justice in their communities. We do this in part by bringing together thought leaders and experts on the most pressing issues related to public safety and the criminal legal system. For example, in 2020, in response to the outcry surrounding the murder of George Floyd and other injustices in our systems of public safety, we established the Future Public Safety Initiative. Through this initiative, we partnered with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives to host a public series of roundtable discussions with leaders from around the country. Based on this series, we published a report establishing a vision and a set of recommendations for redefining public safety across the nation. Today's program, organized by John Jay's Data Collaborative for Justice, continues our efforts to support meaningful dialogue about the challenging public safety issues and policies facing us today. It builds on a day-long event we held on May 13th, where we delved into the hotly debated topic of bail reform in New York State with lawmakers, advocates, researchers, and practitioners. It is clear that the press has played a central role in shaping public discourse on bail reform and its effects on communities. For today's conversation, we are pleased to have a number of journalists from some of New York City's most notable news outlets to share their perspectives on the role of the press in bail reform. We are grateful for the support of Arnold Ventures, which enables us to host these events on bail reform. Thank you to Matt Watkins of the Center for Court Innovation for his advice and contributions in planning this event. And now I'd like to welcome and introduce Susan Shaw, the Managing Director of Racial Justice at Trinity Church, Wall Street. She will moderate the panel today. Susan is a thoughtful voice on issues of racial and social justice in New York, as well as a fantastic partner to John Jay. Thank you, Susan. I will now turn it over to you to lead this conversation.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We are continuing the conversation about bail reform in New York State as a critical follow-up to the John Jay Conference that took place on May 13th. A number of speakers at the conference discussed the role of the media in shaping public dialogue about bail reform and also its relationship to increases in crime, particularly violent crime. As Carol Mason noted, what's been lost in this public debate and reporting are some of the circumstances that have motivated changes to the bail statute, specifically the horrific conditions and inequities of pretrial detention. Rikers, we're talking about Rikers Island in New York City and the death and what led to the death of Kalief Browder back in 2015. What's also missing is what else might be driving the increase in the jail population in New York and across the state. The media has been a consistent key player when it comes to bail reform in New York, and they continue to serve a vital role today as bail reform continues to dominate criminal justice commentary and most importantly, policy. So we're here today to pick up that conversation and speak directly with journalists who have been reporting on criminal justice, public safety, and specifically bail. This is an opportunity to pull the camera back, to understand the media as a key player and not just as an observer when it comes to our collective understanding of criminal justice reform. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to serve as a moderator for the conversation. As Carol noted, I have the pleasure of leading our Racial Justice Initiative at Trinity Church, Wall Street. Our work with the Racial Justice Initiative is inspired by the words of Michelle Alexander, who said that mass incarceration is the biggest racial justice problem of our time. So at Trinity, we're coming at this with multiple tools, including philanthropy, programming, advocacy, and convening. And today we have 5 esteemed journalists with us, and together we are going to delve into the role, responsibility, and the decisions of the media and how they impact the contentious topics of bail reform, pretrial detention, and criminal justice reform. I will quickly introduce them so we can move into our conversation. And so let's start with Matt Katz. Matt is a reporter with WNYC and Gothamist. He reports on public safety, focusing on decarceration and equitable enforcement of the laws. He's also investigated abuse in ICE detention. And he guest hosts on WNYC, the Brian Lehrer Show, which he actually did yesterday, and On the Media. We also have Craig McCarthy. He is the Deputy Police Bureau Chief with the New York Post. His work focuses on the criminal justice system in New York City and the NYPD. He has broke numerous stories about alleged police misconduct, and he's also analyzed crime data for articles to explain recent trends in the justice system. We also have Joshua Solomon. He is a Capitol Bureau reporter with the Albany Times-Union, and he covers state-level politics. Previously, he spent time reporting in rural Massachusetts and suburban Florida. And then we have Ashley Southall. She is the Metro Police Bureau Chief with the New York Times, where she reports and guides coverage of public safety in the NYPD. She joined the Times back in 2008 with the Washington Bureau, and then she covered breaking news on the Central News Desk in New York before joining the Metro Bureau in 2016. And then finally, we have Josefa Velasquez, who is a senior reporter with The City. She covers politics, Metro New York and Albany, and previously she served as the city's political reporter covering the state capitol. So we can move into an initial round of questions with each of these journalists, and then we are going to have a Q&A. So I encourage anyone who has questions to go ahead and drop them into the chat whenever you are ready. And then we have a team that's actually going to take those questions and have them ready for the Q&A. So let's get started. And I'd like to start with Matt. So Matt, you have reported on the current limitations on the media coverage of both crime and public safety programs and policies. So what are your observations about the coverage of bail reform, and specifically why it's getting so much attention from media outlets, given that it's really a technical aspect of the criminal legal process?
Thanks, Susan, and thank you to John Jay. It's very cool to be here. It's also cool to see these bylines that I read all the time, and I look up to the reporting that the other journalists on this panel do. So it's nice to be in all of your company. The reason for all the attention is, from my view, there was a rise in crime at the same exact time as criminal justice reform went into effect in the form of bail reform, and there's a powerful police union and many officers and politicians who talk to reporters and provide anecdotes and tips that supposedly support a correlation between bail reform and rising crime. From my view, the easy thing to do is to quote politicians, quote police unions who say, look, crime went up. Obviously, it's due to bail reform, and many stories have done this. Others have gone further. They've mentioned bail reform while reporting on crimes committed by people who had recently been released on prior offenses. And regardless if the circumstances might be murky of their criminal past, or whether they were actually out on bail or out because of bail reform, no matter what, they still, bail reform is mentioned. It's as if it's still in the ether and might have influenced it in some way, even if it didn't directly influence it. And to me, this is like anecdotal and doesn't necessarily reflect a larger thing. I honestly do not want to criticize my colleague from the New York Post who's on this panel. He and I have spoken about this in the past. Craig does great investigative reporting, and he's actually done great reporting specifically on bail reform. But I looked at the paper in general for a recent story I did for On the Media, the NPR show that WNYC produces, looking just as a whole at the Post because of what, from my vantage point, has its great influence on city and state public policy. And in reporting that, I learned that the tabloids in general in the city have pushed for more aggressive policing and incarceration for at least a half a century. In terms of just like naming and shaming judges who release someone who goes out to commit another offense, in terms of their editorial boards and columnists I mean, there's a perspective that, you lock more people up and you keep the streets safe. And that perspective, particularly now, there's other ways of viewing that now that I think need to be incorporated into some of our reporting. From the time of bail reform's passage in 2019 until the rollbacks this spring, there were hundreds of stories in the Post that mentioned bail reform, overwhelmingly, negative, connecting it to increased crime, horrific specific crimes, and they don't, and some of those crimes were related to bail, or the people who committed them might have been out because of bail reform, others not. But regardless, there's not the context that I've been trying to include in some of my reporting that, they're out because they might have been out regardless if they weren't poor, if then they made bail, or they might go to Rikers and literally die. And I think some of that I'm trying, at least personally, trying to include in my reporting. But the New York Post has a ton of influence. I mean, it's at the bodega. You see the headlines. Their stories are mentioned by the mayor at the press conference the next day. They're tweeted out by the police unions, and from my vantage point, they had a good deal of influence in the rollbacks that we saw this spring, even though the connection between bail reform and rising crime at this point is anecdotal and not statistical. We don't have the stats to prove it. But the headline, the day the bail reform went into effect in the Post was "Welcome to New York, the state where criminals go free, and get out of jail starts today. Get out of jail law starts today." So, and that's been the perspective that eventually seemed to be adopted by the political establishment in the state and the governor, really, that bail reform had something to do with rising crime. I'll say one more thing before I go. There is a storytelling challenge here in telling, the other side of things. So you can't really, it's hard to tell a story about a guy who didn't lose his job, an apartment, and lost his custody of his kids because he spent 6 months at Rikers over a $500 bail he couldn't afford. It's hard to just tell that story. It doesn't work as well in the way the media is constructed. And I think that's part of the issue. But makes a great story to tell about the guy who got out due to bail reform and then, smeared poop on people. That makes a better headline and gets more clicks and works better in the way we do media. But I think those are all the things that are in the ether right now that have shaped this argument, this debate.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And so Craig, I want to give you a chance in a second to speak as well, and then I have a question for you, Ashley. But one of the things that is really clear is that bail reform is it's totally misunderstood what the purpose is, and one of the pieces that comes up a lot in the news coverage that I want you to just kind of comment on for a second is accountability and judgment regarding culpability, right? Like the way that the public often, I think, thinks about this is that if bail is not set on someone, then that means that our legal system, or judges in particular, are not taking the crime or the harm seriously. And so is this something that journalists need to point out? Like, is it important to kind of talk about what the purpose of bail is, or would you say that, would you say something different around that? And this is for you, Matt.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was.
Yeah. No. So I was just like,
the last piece of what you said.
No. Yeah. So this whole thing of the notion that the purpose of bail is actually to hold people accountable, or is to make a judgment around culpability, right? There's a big misunderstanding around that. And so is that something that journalists need to be pointing out every time they're reporting on bail?
Yeah, I mean, it's technically to make sure that they show up to court. I mean, that is the purpose. And I think, we could make that point in stories, but in reality, that doesn't seem to be the way it's often implemented. That doesn't seem to be why prosecutors are necessarily, it's not determinative of what prosecutors suggest for bail or how judges make the determination. So I do think we could point it out, but it's also pointing out a thing the way it's supposed to exist, but doesn't exist in reality.
That's a great point. That's really helpful. So Craig, first of all, let's just like acknowledge that the Post has many reporters. And, there's one article that I wanted to kind of bring up and, kind of building upon what Matt shared, that you were a co-author from July 2020, which was titled "The NYPD's Own Stats Debunk Claims of Bail." So the article talked about how while NYPD officials maybe were saying that bail reform was the cause of the certain shootings, that their stats reflected differently. And so I'm just curious, from where you sit, like, how do you, one, account for this difference of opinion within the same publication? I think, some would want to know, but also, what are your thoughts on, the fact that there is this disconnect between data and what folks are saying?
Well, I mean, speaking to the article that came out in 2020, I mean, that actually came after a long holiday weekend, and police officials went up and, basically pointed the finger at bail reform at that point for that. And, what my reporting had found was that they were including not only the people who they arrested, who pulled the triggers, allegedly, they were also including the victims and witnesses. So it was still a small number. So it was inflated, but it was still a very, very small percentage of these these people that were connected in any way to bail reform. And so, I mean, I can only really speak to my own reporting, but I just tend to follow what the data is showing, right? So what is happening? When I looked at the neighborhood safety teams recently, we found a bunch of people, a handful of people that were let out with no bail or very little bail, but had loaded firearms. The mail messaging coming from the city and from public officials is that these teams were supposed to get the guys off the street that were pulling triggers. That were the guys that were the most dangerous of the dangerous. So just pointing out, because when bail reform was passed, I mean, people I've spoken to that were part of the process, that this was supposed to be an evolving thing. It wasn't set and then done. It was supposed to be looked at and analyzed. But then, as I've recently reported too, they never collected baseline data. So we're kind of sitting here with this being so politicized because politicians kind of fell short here, right? We have data from the courts that is post-bail reform. So we can see what's happening percentages wise of reoffense rates, all of those figures that would be critical to analyzing if there is any correlation between bail reform and the recent rise in crime. But since we don't have 2018, 2019 data that's publicly released, we can't, the data is essentially useless at this point. So we're kind of stuck in this system where we're just, they talk about reforming things, and it just becomes a political talking point a lot of the times, and every time it's coming up. And I think, Matt touched on this, and we touched on this earlier when we talked that, it's such, everything seems to be linked to bail when politicians talk. So, and it's our job to look at whether it was or not, right? So our job to figure out if it was, what actually happened here, because I think it's just used as a catchphrase or a catch-all for anything that happens. So, and we should know too, when we're talking about data, there's a little bit of things that we can't account for, right? So we know that 30% of shootings result in an arrest on a rolling basis, so give or take. So that's still 70% of shootings that we don't know who did the shooting. And I don't know, I have no information that correlates to any rise or any connection to bail reform, since the shootings did rise in every city across the country, every major city across the country. But I think we still always talk about that. There is this, for every crime, is not 100% clearance rate. So we don't know what happens with all of these.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because, one of the things that, I don't know if I see enough coverage of, at least in my opinion, is, the other societal factors and causes of what actually causes violence, what causes gun violence. We've seen this now increase in gun violence, not just in New York, but in other places across the country that either have never even thought about bail reform or maybe, are further along. And so, can you talk a little bit about maybe, what the challenges are, or what you think needs to happen, or what is happening in terms of covering, all of the societal factors that have definitely been exacerbated during the pandemic, and how that relates to violence, as to get away from this like catch-all, like, okay, bail reform, bail reform, bail reform.
Well, I think it's the investments in the other systems, that, homeless shelters, all these things that we've defunded over the years. And quite frankly, if you talk to any police officer in any state, that what's happened over the last few decades is we've cut social services, right? And then we'd say, okay, well then cops should respond to this. And I've talked to multiple cops, high-level cops, low-level cops. The worst thing they want to do is go to a situation where there's somebody that's having a mental like breakdown or something like that, because those are the most dangerous for the person and them. And they, I mean, statistically, we already know often turn out to be some of the worst incidents because they're not trained in the sense dealing with those kind of incidents goes against the actual core of policing training, which is to end a situation as quickly as possible and safely as possible to the least amount of people. And yes, they do get training now and de-escalation and all these separate things, but there's two counter narratives and like or two counter training. So how do you flip that switch and when do you know to do the other thing? I think that's why those happens. And this is what the push has been lately for mental health workers going out on calls and helping with homelessness and stuff. But the problem is that I think Josh can talk about this more, is the funding hasn't been there, right? So we're not seeing, the same amount of funding that's going into these social services, which would argue that that's likely what's driving a lot of these issues, right? So shootings, it is, there's a lot of young kids doing shootings. Like where are we investing in doing those things? And, the thing we should talk about too is those investments. And I think this is what gets lost a lot of time too. It's not going to change overnight. It's not going to change. It might not change by double-digit percentiles of our shootings going down. It's something that's going to take time and you work up to. But I think with these investments, the problem is you can't point to something in 6 months, say, look, I spent X amount of money and look what it did. So, that is something we should be talking about all the time.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So let's, Ashley, as a reporter with the New York Times, obviously very much a local, but definitely a national, international, publication. Can you talk a little bit about, what you've been hearing and reporting when it comes to bail? And I just want to, note that what I've seen is that the Times has reported extensively on Rikers, police reform, other criminal justice topics, including community-based alternatives to incarceration. But it's not like, every article is about bail. And so I'd love to, hear from your perspective. Why is that? And what are you seeing from where you sit?
And then unmute myself here. I think my response is gonna probably reiterate some points my colleagues have already made, which is that in the landscape, there's just a real void of information that determinatively shows the impact of bail reform. There's a lot of suggestion and hints and yelling and screaming and defending and blaming, but there's a real void of data. And bail reform since January 2020 has just really been this football where it's impossible for us to say that bail reform is doing this, that, or the other, because it's not only is there no real data examining its impact, but it's also in many arguments being lumped together with other policies. And that makes it really difficult to make some headway. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do and that the Times tries to do is to bring a signal into the noise. And with bail reform, that really hasn't, we just really haven't found a way to do that without getting entangled in what is, frankly, to me, a mess of political rhetoric and people with different agendas trying to make something happen. What we, I think, would like to see is information and data that we can point to and draw some real themes from or elucidate some serious problems. In our reporting on bail reform, we have highlighted the lack of data, the lack of real information. I remember when in one of the first crime briefings of 2020, when the police commissioner and the mayor came bursting out of the gate blaming bail reform for the rise in crime that January, that we had a real contentious debate in the Times about whether we should cover it, and we did. But I fought very hard to point out that they had no data substantiating or even convincing us that there was anything behind their claims, and that has remained true 2.5 years later.
That's really helpful. It's helpful to kind of get a little bit like a sense of what happens behind the scenes, right? As you guys are making these decisions. Since you mentioned data, let's go to that and bring Josh into the conversation. So Josh, with the Times Union, a lot of your coverage references data. And as you know, researchers from organizations like the John Jay Data Collaborative for Justice, have consistently said there's no evidence that bail reform is driving this increase in crime. And then we have contrasting public opinion. So for example, let's take a look at the Siena poll that came out a little while ago, around the peak budget and legislative season that found that a majority of New Yorkers supported further rollbacks of the bail law because of public safety concerns. So can you talk a little bit about this challenge for reporters when you have this disconnect, the data and the experts versus public opinion, and how do you reconcile that, or what do you do about that as a journalist?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me on. And I echo the sentiments that everyone else on the panel has said, that there are lots of challenges, and it's a complicated topic. And I think that's why we're all on and trying to unpack it a little further, and we're all learning from each other as we go. I think it's always important to lead with the data, especially lead with data that researchers point out. I do have to really shout out John Jay for helping us reporters look through the data and understand what is bail eligible. I mean, stepping back, which crimes are bail eligible, which alleged crimes are bail eligible, is not a simple like yes this and no that. It's extremely complicated, and which the legislature has done. They've made it very nuanced, very this and that, which has left journalists trying to figure out what's accurate, which has left researchers what's accurate, which has left judges figuring out what they can do. And that all is playing into it. So yes, you go back to the data. I've written data story after data story on it. And I can say that, sometimes you write too much data and people have a tough time honing in on it. And as Matt and Craig pointed out before, oftentimes it's about the stories that you can tell about people who could have been held on bail, weren't, maybe because of these reforms and what outcomes they had. So those storytellings are really difficult. But one data point that I think is important, and I know we talk about that there's nothing saying what happened before versus now. And there is data in the city through MOCJ that does kind of help us figure out New York City centric, not statewide, but is that you can look at through the state's data set, well, is there, what's the outcome in cases in which judges had the discretion to set bail and chose not to? And you see that the rate of rearrest, particularly on a violent felony, and obviously the arrests are always alleged cases, that's the same rate as the rest of the population, as what happens in cases in which, as a part of bail reform, it's people are out and are under supervised release or under their own recognizance. So we know that the rates are similar regardless of whether it's a crime in which, an alleged crime in which they had an eligibility for bail or didn't. And so I know I'm saying a lot of data stuff and it glaze over people's eyes, but like there's a level here where like we know that like we know outcomes are similar. And so how do you move through the noise? And I obviously, as others have pointed out, that's our job as reporters, to sort through that noise and figure out what's going on. But obviously the term bail reform has become it's two words that you can say at the kitchen table and have a conversation about and put around that. I have issues about poverty. I have issues about crime. I have issues about what's going on in the corner, what's going on in my neighborhood. And like, it's become a phrase that's very accessible for people to talk about, which I think is a reason why we continue to use it in the media, because it's accessible to people. But obviously the big question is, how do you do that responsibly and hold people who are using it for political agendas to a check on either side?
Yeah, thank you. And one of the questions that I have, and I agree that data is really important. And then I also think that, yeah, like bail reform has just become this very easy thing to just kind of mischaracterize, is Is this just what we're going to see with any big criminal justice reform, where you have this disconnect between what the public says and what the experts say? And, and Josh, I don't know if you have anything more you want to say on this, and then I want to bring Josefa in, but, what's the role of the journalist in that sort of situation when it's clear we are trying to undo something that is huge and has been and will need big changes, in order to actually be dismantled, as we're talking about with mass incarceration?
I think it is really difficult. And look, Mayor Adams ran a campaign on crime and won his campaign in a ranked choice election on crime. And that it's going to continue to be an issue. It's going to be something that we talk about. We're always going to talk about our safety, and we're always going to have the backdrop of to what extent did the pandemic influence the outcomes of what we're seeing. That's never going to change. We can hope that the state, if they do have data that's rich from prior to bail reform, that they release that data. But it's for now, we just have to think about, well, what are the outcomes, what's going on, and really what's also important is and this is what Craig was touching on before, what money are we putting as a state toward when we do put someone under supervised release, how are we helping them get to a point where they return to court and that they're getting the services that they need? And that's not necessarily part of the conversation because it's not as sexy as talking about whether someone ended up being charged of a violent felony after the fact. But did that person get better access to school, education, job training? Was there a moment in which the state in its official sense touched that individual and had an opportunity to steer that person toward contributing in the way that government officials want them to contribute in society, and avoiding pretrial detention in ways that we know that it's also costly at Rikers and other jails. So all those things are at play, and I think others on the panel can speak to it even better.
Yeah. And one thing that was really clear from the John Jay conference was, that the level of investments, if you're comparing what's being invested in New York City and with regard to supervised release and beyond that, just far outpaces what is available elsewhere in the state, right? And that there is a huge disconnect there. Absolutely. So Josefa, I'd love to bring you in. And, there was actually, I saw there's been a lot of questions that have come up, but someone asked, like, where can I learn about bail reform? Well, this is a good article that was written by Josefa with the city, in February, where you wrote an article with the title, "Why is Bail Reform So Controversial?" And the article was great. It provided a primer on the mechanics of the reforms and also the political wrangling. If you could talk a little bit about what inspired that piece, I think it would be, really great to hear your perspective.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I think one of the main reasons we decided to write this piece is basically because over and over again, we were seeing in the media, at press conferences, people that were in power using bail reform as a shorthand for what they thought was wrong with public safety and the increase in crime in the city. And so what we really wanted to do was break down, like, okay, what does bail reform actually do? Because you're seeing the mayor at this point, and even to this day, blaming Albany for not doing anything over bail and not clawing it back a bit more. I mean, even since that article was written in February, the bail laws have been changed yet again to include, certain gun crimes, certain hate crimes. So it's an ever evolving issue. And I think in a lot of ways, bail reform fell victim to a news cycle and the pandemic. And I think it's going to be hard to sort of disentangle the two when, shortly after the bail reform laws were passed in January 2020, there was, a slew of anti-Semitic crimes, and then the pandemic hit. So that narrative sort of stayed along through the next couple of months. The legislature sort of quietly tweaked the laws. And then, again, over the last few months, especially with Eric Adams, like coming into the mayoralty and immediately having, 2 officers get killed. And then you had, the shooting on the subway in Sunset Park, and then another shooting on the Q train. So it's the perception that has really led people to really even know the words bail reform, right? You just hear it bandied about. So I think what we were trying to do is really explain how wonky this is. And I think you had mentioned early on that like this is really mechanical and like really technical in nature. And I think at the same time, you had a situation where judges didn't necessarily know how to apply the new bail laws. They didn't feel empowered. And maybe that is a function of the pandemic because sort of all the air was sucked out of the room when these laws went into effect. And there wasn't enough time to, gear people up and do any sort of educational outreach. But at the same time, and we had talked about this, early this week, it's hard to find the best case scenario story because, as Matt had mentioned earlier, there are people that have benefited from these reforms, right? They're not sitting in Rikers languishing. They are able to get out. They're able to live their lives normally. But how can an organization like a criminal justice reform organization really sort of change the narrative that we're seeing around bail reform? You need to have someone who is willing to have their name be publicly attached to, being arrested and being charged, or having that be part of the permanent record anytime like an employer might Google them. So it's harder to find subjects to show how the bail laws are in fact helpful.
I'm glad that you brought that up. One thing that I would like to delve into a little bit, and Matt, you brought this up and it's come up, I think it's very much related to the investments piece as well that Craig, you and others talked about. Like, how do we show that something is actually working? And I recognize data is obviously one important way to do that. Because if you're trying to show that someone didn't commit crimes, that someone did go to work, someone did go to school, and I know there's a lot of challenges because if cases are open, people are reluctant to come forward, or, there might be other reasons, but like, how do we actually do that so that, assuming that we think reforms are needed, as journalists in your stories, can you talk about things that have worked, or maybe share a little bit more about challenges? Matt, since you brought it up first, I just want to give you a chance to start, but I welcome other folks also chiming in.
Yeah, it is incredibly hard. It's like proving a negative. I mean, one way to do it is just to change the perspective on what working means. So if bail reform is working, that can be judged not just in like crime stats, but also in the number of people held at Rikers and a reporting focus on understanding on what incarceration does. And it's about like changing the framing maybe and broadening the framing that arrests and incarceration are not necessarily net positives for overall public safety due to the impact that incarceration has on people when it comes to lack of medical care, thousands of appointments missed every month at Rikers, medical appointments missed every month, the emotional and financial trauma that incarceration and the resulting family separation has on not just the individuals who are arrested, but also their loved ones, the trauma that mass incarceration has on corrections officers who are attacked 8 times a day at Rikers Island, and their families when they face abuse. So I think it's almost about broadening the way we report on crime and what crime means and what incarceration means when it comes to public safety. Maybe I should say broadening the way we view public safety, not just crime. Like what makes us safe?
Yeah.
From the person on the subway who's getting, punched in the face by somebody who was released due to bail reform, all the way to the corrections officer who is raped by an inmate who's stuck at Rikers Island because he can't make $1,000 bail and he really should have been receiving a mental health treatment and not incarcerated indefinitely.
Yeah, thank you. does anyone else want to kind of like, just even talk about the challenges? I mean, Craig, if I can just kind of bring you in, as, we know the Post has, written a lot about this issue. You guys are, very, very influential. And what are the challenges of getting to that bigger story? There's like that phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, and you mentioned that even during our prep call. Like, I'd love to kind of hear your thinking around that.
Well, I think, there's kind of differences here too in news coverage is, a daily story or you're doing an in-depth piece, like we're doing dailies. A lot of times it's a short piece. I mean, we still write for print a lot of times, obviously we still have online, but, we're writing about what the news of the day is. And then there's the following up. Let's see what these all mean together, right? And I think, and we've been talking about this, and I feel like talk to any journalist in New York City or New York State, it's the data. I mean, you have to be able to set benchmarks. Like when lawmakers were doing these things, when they passed bail reform, they should have been thinking about, how do we deem this a success, right? Like, how do we say in a year when they wanted to rewrite the laws, what was working and what was not working, if anything? And the problem is that there weren't these benchmarks set, or maybe all the benefits from being diverted to mental health treatment or being diverted to some sort of abuse, anything that could have kind of shown, at least to the public, I guess, to make the case to. And I think this kind of speaks to, we were talking about before, about the disconnect between what the minimal data we have shows and what the public perception is. And I think that case was never made to them in that from politicians and from the people that passed bail reform. So when they're talking to a cop and you have a business that gets broken into 6-7 times and a few businesses in the area, the cop comes to the scene, and I've talked to business owners and they'll say, it's because of bail reform, he keeps getting out. And some cases that is, but some cases it isn't. So kind of, as again, it's our job to weed through that. But I think to tell the actual story of the day and then to tell a long form story. And I think the problem becomes, as Ashley said before, it's hard to tell that story, the long form story, because we're missing crucial information here.
Yeah, that brings up, a question that actually came from, with the Q&A about sources. So it'd be great to kind of, hear your thoughts on, the main sources. I mean, one thing that, has come up, and I mentioned this to Ashley, for anyone who watched the press correspondence dinner that Trevor Noah hosted, there was like a nice little joke that was targeted at the Times about, just using law enforcement as their only sources. But I think that, there's some practical realities here, and, would love to hear your thoughts on sourcing, who are the main sources, and, especially, are you able to access like public defenders, lawyers, folks that may have different viewpoints, maybe from law enforcement? Ashley, do you want to start, and then we can bring anyone else in?
Yeah, sure. So take any big breaking news story, a bombing, a stabbing, shooting. Oftentimes the first, and for a while, the only source is law enforcement. You have your people on the ground trying to get information, but it's the people who are going to know first and foremost and have information about, for instance, who the suspect is in the case, is going to be law enforcement. And they will have a name, they will know the arrest history of that person, and they might blame bail reform. And then you have to go to prosecutors, you have to go to courts and try to get records. I mean, these are very time-consuming tasks that are not always instantaneously available. You'll have to ask, prosecutors' offices, what was the bail request, what was granted, what and why they made certain requests. Was bail reform affected by this? It's a lot of back and forth. It takes a lot of time. At the same time, you're trying to build out like what happened, say aboard the N train, for example, and so it takes a lot of asking around, sometimes circulating to different sources, and you still may not emerge with a clear answer as to whether or not bail reform or some other policy played a role in this, in a case. One of the examples that I often kind of come around to is the case of Asamat Nash, who was accused of stabbing to death Christina Yuna Lee. And early on, there was blame for bail reform because he had an earlier arrest where he had punched a guy at the subway. And it was like bail reform, bail reform, bail reform. But when I looked into it, I actually found out that he got a desk appearance ticket because the way the law was written, the arresting officer had discretion whether to arrest him or to give him a desk appearance ticket. And desk appearance tickets aren't really part of the bail reform legislation, and there's different guidance. You don't go to court when you get a desk appearance ticket until basically almost 2 months after a crime has been committed. So that really was not a bail reform decision. That wasn't a judge saying, oh, I can't set money for this. It was a cop making a decision that in this case, a ticket was warranted for him to come to court at a later date. And that's how he wound up free. And then later on, but even still, it assumes a lot of the framing of the debate around bail reform assumes that a bail decision facilitates or has a causal connection to crime. And in some cases, people who were freed because of bail or because a judge could not set bail or had to set the lowest form of bail, there's not really a prior indication of that they're on a trajectory to that level of violence. They may have like 10 or 20 fare evasion arrests and then they do a murder, and it's like, well, where was the sign of escalation there? So it's a really challenging thing, you can ask every court, every prosecutor, every police officer, interview family members, and still not necessarily see the trajectory that person was on before that really serious crime was committed.
I
Josh,
just want to jump in and say that, and I agree everything with what you were saying, Ashley, that public defenders, like in the context of up in Albany and the debate on changes to the bail law, they were very accessible, especially those down in the city, and to talk about kind of the policy and the rhetoric around it. But I think as I'm just kind of listening here, oftentimes, and like, this in crime reporting, that the first narrative, our first right through on a story tends to be what people remember, and that impression. I mean, you think even to like the Boston bomber in the marathon, like that first story as it was being like told on, say, CNN, and people were watching the development, people still think about the story in the framework of how we first heard it and not what the final events on the story were. What was the actual events that happened as opposed to what we first heard. And I think that speaks to the speed at which breaking news happens and when high profile things occur. And I understand that, legal aid and public defenders are under resourced and overworked, and I appreciate that. But cops tend to have a lot more resources and have an arm to speak to the media. But the ability to get out in front and to explain their perspective in each instance and it's on us also to reach out, but to have some balance in the story. So it's not just the police say bail reform, people on the block are saying bail reform, but let's talk a little more about it. But it's tough when you're moving in a very quick pace and we have breaking news and you want to get it out. And there's also a level of responsibility, I think, from the press when there is a dangerous situation to let people know what's going on. It's better than, reading about something that's completely out of context that you may see on social media or some other device. So I think those are difficult. And one other thing I was just going to mention is that in-house at the Times Union, we've decided not to use in headlines and unless we're quoting it verbatim, the words bail reform. We often write changes to the bail law or some kind of clunky phrase that just that don't leave a connotation that it's either positive or negative. And bail reforming has a positive connotation, but obviously law enforcement and the Republican Party have used it as a very pejorative kind of term. And I do think that there's a level in which the media can say, let's not keep using the word bail reform, bail reform, bail reform, because it is a political trope at this point. How can we desensitize it and just talk about what's actually at play, which is a technical thing?
Yeah. Well, so let's, and I'm looking at, we've got about 5 minutes, and this is another question that I saw come up, and it goes back to this piece about, social services, housing, all these other things that we know influence public safety, right? And are not often connected. And so it would be great, Josefa, if we can start with you, just, get your thoughts, like, what does it take to actually be able to effectively communicate? Let's use housing, for example. That's an area that we care a lot about at Trinity. And, most New Yorkers are also talking about this issue, as being, a really important issue when it comes to public safety, so that it, is pithy. It just comes right out the way bail reform does.
I don't think that there is a cure-all for that. I mean, I think the only way to deal with it is with time and a lot of money, because unfortunately, to show that supportive housing works or affordable housing works, you need a longer length of time to say that this person who had maybe previously had committed a crime, was out on bail, and lived a successful life. Like, what is that success? How do you measure it? Like, how long? Is it a year that they are rehabilitated, 2 years, 3 years? So I think it becomes a lot harder to try to prove the positive, because you do need, an extended amount of time where this person can, rehabilitate, so to speak. And, same goes for like mental health services. Like, trying to find the barometer of success there is, very sort of squishy. Like, one person's success might not be success for everyone else. So it's less binary, I think, when you're trying to compare something like bail reform to like the opposite end of things, and how supportive housing, how mental health services, how community just helps them essentially. So I think, at this point, we're 2 years out since the laws first went into effect. I don't know necessarily that, this discussion is going to go away. I think to talk about bail reform and to talk about criminal justice and public safety, we also have to talk about the whole defund the police narrative, and how that really also contributed to sort of a distrust between police and the community, and also a lack of morale amongst officers. So now there's an us versus them sort of scenario that has really, stained what's happened in the last 2 years, and how the conversation over changes to bail laws is black and white for a lot of people.
So we only have 2 minutes, and someone is drilling in another room, I think, or another part of this house, so I could hear it. Hope it's not disturbing you. But can anyone just offer like a quick, is anyone more optimistic? Is there a way to do this quickly and not wait for a long-term kind of solution? Ashley, I see you raising your hand. Feel free.
Yeah, I think my response is kind of to wrap up some things that other people said. I think we have to remember that the bail law is a relatively small part of a much larger criminal justice equation and a public safety equation. And as Craig mentioned earlier, like in most crimes, there are no arrests. So it's like, what do you do to create safety in the absence of an arrest? And I think so it's important to, and that was part of the calls of defund the police, and even before defund the police. We have lots of kids who have access to guns, who may be involved in robberies and are on this path that just doesn't lead any place good. And there are ways to intervene. I think that we have, one of my favorite stories is a story I did about a healing circle out in Sheepshead Bay, because it was a police commander working with the community organizations in his community to bring in the young men who are at the highest risk of being either perpetrators or victims of gun violence, and sitting them down and really working through their lives, their trauma, helping them to get IDs. I mean, this is basic stuff that they didn't have or know how to access, and he's helping them with, and that's beginning to facilitate a behavioral change among those young people. So I think it's important for us to kind of keep an eye on things like that. And it also requires, you know, those community organizations and those people who are both giving and receiving those services to have an openness to give us access. I mean, I had to go sit in that circle, and that was a very, that required a lot of trust from them to me and from me to them. But I was grateful they let me do it, because I think it was a significant story to tell about like what else we can do to keep us safe that doesn't require arresting people, putting them in cages, and interrupting these paths and these cycles of violence.
Very well said. And I think that we will end on that. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley, Craig, Joshua, Josefa, and Matt, and to the Data Collaborative for Justice. There's going to be a lot more, I think, to talk about in the future, but I really am so grateful that you all spent the last hour with us unpacking the role and the promise with the media. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me.